Hello, welcome to Chapter 5, Validity. As you know, there are three qualities of a good test. We want tests to be reliable, valid, and standardized. So this chapter explores validity. Slides 2 and 3 give you an outline of the chapter. Slides 4 and 5 give you the learning objectives. So I will skip down to slide 6 and continue lecture on slide 6. The Griggs versus Duke Power case was a landmark case argued in 1970, and a decision was reached by the Supreme Court in 1971. Willie Griggs was an employee of Duke Power in North Carolina. He worked as a laborer, and he wanted to be promoted one level up to be a coal handler. He had to pass an IQ test in order to be promoted. Okay, he sued Duke Power, and his lawsuit was based on the meaning of test scores. So it appeared Duke Power was discriminating against its black employees. At that time, there were 95 employees. 14 of those were black, and 13 of the 14 black employees swept and cleaned. They worked as laborers. And the main obstacle for moving up in the company was this IQ test. So the Supreme Court ruled that the test was not related to measuring job capabilities. That in fact the IQ test served as a built-in headwinds for minority groups. The test did not measure specific job capabilities. So the Griggs versus Duke Power case became the basis for the Civil Rights Bill of 1990, which amended the Civil Rights Bill of 1964, and it banned employment discrimination. So employers now have to show that a test used for selection or for promotion has a specific meaning. In establishing the validity of a test, we gather evidence to show a test has a particular meaning for a particular purpose. So we must prove that our test is valid by accumulating or gathering evidence. Validity answers two questions. Does a test measure what it is supposed to measure, what it purports to measure, and how well does it measure it? The interpretation of test scores derives from validity evidence. So, for example, a test might indicate that it measures marital satisfaction, but if we examine the validity evidence, we might find the test is only good at predicting the number of fights a couple may have. Okay, so some might contend that the number of fights a couple has really isn't related to marital satisfaction. You could have couples who don't fight at all and they're not very satisfied with their marriage, or couples who fight a lot who are very satisfied with their marriage. So just like in Griggs versus Duke Power, where the IQ test did not measure job capability, a test may not measure what it purports to measure. So we need to look at the validity evidence. The validation of an instrument or a test is a gradual accumulation of evidence that provides an indication of whether the instrument does in fact measure what it is intended to measure. So for many tests, validity information is provided in the test manual. It's not the test itself that is validated, rather it's the uses of the test that are validated. So, for example, the Wechsler Intelligence Scale, the Wechsler IQ test, if it's used for assessing self-esteem, it's not a valid use of the Wechsler. So, before using a test, a psychologist must evaluate the validation evidence or the validity evidence and determine if there is enough evidence to support using that test in a specific manner. So, as you already know from the previous chapter, reliability is a prerequisite to validity. If a measure has too much unsystematic error, random error, it can't measure anything consistently. Now, a test can be reliable but not valid. A test may measure something consistently but not measure what it is designed to measure. So we first look at reliability evidence or information in the test manual, and then we look at validity evidence. We look at what it measures and how well the instrument measures what it was designed to assess or measure. Now you see on this slide there are 4 types of validity. Okay, the Joint Commission, the Joint Commission, which published, the standards for educational and psychological testing, does not consider face validity a type of validity. So, according to the standards for educational and psychological testing, there are 3 types of validity. But we talk about face validity because it's commonly used in testing literature. So face validity is the mere appearance that a test has validity. So if I gave you an arithmetic test and asked you about geographical places, that would not have face validity. Okay, if you were taking a typing test and you got some engineering questions, it just wouldn't be face valid. So it needs to appear to be valid, and that can motivate a person if it looks like it's measuring what it purports to measure. Okay, and then we have content, criterion, and construct validity, which I will talk about at more length in the next slides. A test has content validity or content-related validity to the extent that it adequately samples the conceptual domain. So an educational test, in psychological testing, for example, let's say I told you that we would have a test on the first 5 chapters of Kaplan and Sakuza's book. And you take the test and you find out that 85% of the material comes from chapter 5 and only 15% comes from the other 4 chapters. So that test does not have content-related validity. It didn't adequately sample the conceptual domain. I tell you I'm giving you a test on arithmetic, and there are addition and multiplication problems, no subtraction or division. Doesn't have content validity. Now think about Binet's original IQ test, the Binet-Simon. Did it have content validity? Take a minute to think about it. If you remember, it had 30 items, all of which were verbal. 30 items does not adequately sample the conceptual domain of intelligence. So it did not have content validity. In determining content validity, we want to consider if the items chosen for the test are a fair sample of the content area or domain. Content validity is particularly related to educational tests and achievement tests in particular. Now, some argue that content validity is not true validity. Although it's difficult to separate content validity from other types of validity, one of the unique features of content validity is that it's the only type of validity for which the evidence is logical and not statistical. Now, the latest version of standards for educational and psychological tests discusses two issues relevant to content validity. The first, as you see on the slide, is construct underrepresentation. So this is the failure to capture important components of a construct. So, for example, a test of mathematical knowledge includes algebra and not geometry. Another example, a test of world history contains most of the items on European history. So, similar to examples I gave you on the previous slide, and this is construct underrepresentation. So the validity of each of the tests that I mentioned would be threatened by construct underrepresentation. Excuse me. The second issue is construct irrelevant variance. This occurs when scores are influenced by factors irrelevant to the construct. So a test of intelligence might be influenced by reading comprehension, that the person was tested and the reading comprehension level was way too high for the child who took the test. So construct irrelevant variance. Onto criterion-related validity. Criterion-related validity tells us how well a test predicts something. Okay, a more formal definition would be the extent to which a test is systematically related to an outcome criterion. So, with criterion-related validity, we are interested in the degree to which the test is a good predictor of certain criterion. So, for example, a test might be used to predict which engaged couples will have successful marriages and which will get divorced. So the test essentially stands in for the measure we're interested in, and that measure is future marital happiness. Now, evidence of criterion-related validity does not apply to every type of test because the focus with criterion-related validity is on how well the test predicts certain behaviors. That is the criterion. So the SAT or the ACT predicts academic performance in college. The GATB, G-A-T-B, the General Aptitude Test Battery, predicts performance in certain occupations. So for the SAT, the criterion is academic performance in college. For the GATB, performance in certain occupations. Now, to complicate your lives, there are two types of criterion-related validity. We have concurrent and predictive. And the difference between the two types is the period of time between taking the test and gathering the criterion information. So the words themselves tell you the meaning. In concurrent, there is no time lag between when the test is given and when the criterion is gathered. So we use concurrent validity when we want an immediate prediction, let's say a diagnosis. So if someone's depressed and we think they may be suicidal, we're not going to wait months to see if they do become suicidal. We want concurrent information. So can the test be substituted for some criterion measures such as depression or suicidality? Okay, in predictive validity, if we wanted to develop a test that would identify which high school students would graduate from college, we'd administer the test while the students were in high school, and we'd have to wait until they graduated from college to gather the criterion information. So implicit in the concept of criterion validity is the idea that tests are used as part of a decision-making process. The test will be valid to the degree that it improves the effectiveness of decision-making. Another example of criterion-related validity. So a learning disability test and school performance. So we know school performance isn't going so well. So the test explains poor performance and it gives us diagnostic information. The measure and the criterion measures are taken at the same time because the test is designed to explain why the child is having difficulty in school. So children with learning difficulties oftentimes take tests to help guide an independent educational plan, an IEP. Another example of concurrent validity. Job samples provide a good example of concurrent validity evidence. IO psychologists have to select employees based on limited information. So you test potential employees on a sample of behaviors that represent the task they'll have to perform on the job. And research has told us that samples of mechanical work correlate quite well with performance on the job. And this is also true for work samples in a variety of areas, particularly blue-collar trades or jobs requiring manipulation of objects. Validity coefficients. So the relationship between a test and a criterion is usually expressed as a correlation called a validity coefficient. And this validity coefficient tells us the extent to which the test is valid for making statements about the criteria. So for example, can we look at a particular score on the GRE and predict success in graduate school? Another example, can we look at a score on an eating disorders inventory, excuse me, and decide that the person has a diagnosis of an eating disorder? So seldom do we see validity coefficients greater than 0.6. The range we usually see in good testing in test manuals falls between 0.3 to 0.4. That's considered high. In many situations, using a test isn't worth the effort because it contributes only a few percentage points to understanding the variation in a criterion. But sometimes validity coefficients can be useful even though they may only explain a small percentage of the variation in the criteria. So an example of this can be found in your textbook in one of the focus boxes. In 1967, a researcher demonstrated that a military screening test could save taxpayers millions every month, even though the validity wasn't very high. your textbook also discusses cholesterol. So predictive validity applies to medical tests as well as psychological tests. So high cholesterol levels can predict early death from heart disease and stroke. So the test is the blood cholesterol level, and the criterion is premature death. The level of association, however, is quite low, 0.1, or it accounts for about 1% of the variance in mortality. So these low validity coefficients tell us little about what can be predicted for a particular individual. But you need to keep in mind that over 600,000 Americans die each year from heart disease. So if we reduce cholesterol levels, there will be a significant reduction in deaths. The low correlation between cholesterol levels and heart disease, 0.1, suggests we can't know which individuals will benefit, but there's a small but significant relationship, and there's some important predictive value in cholesterol levels. The last type of validity is construct-related validity. Construct-related validity concerns the extent to which a test measures a theoretical or hypothetical construct or trait, like depression, extroversion, anxiety, conscientiousness, self-esteem, etc. Now, these psychological constructs are very complex phenomena that cannot be simply measured and validated. With many psychological constructs, there is no universally defined criterion or agreed upon content. Thus, the process of establishing validity for these constructs is complex and consists of a gradual accumulation of information or evidence. A test construct validity can't be verified through one study. Construct validity is demonstrated by multiple pieces of evidence that indicate the instrument or test is measuring the construct or the trait of interest. Construct validation involves assembling evidence about what a test really means, and this is done by showing the relationship between a test and other tests and measures. Each time a relationship is established, one additional bit of meaning can be attached to the test. So construct validation is an ongoing process. Campbell and Fisk did a lot of work in regards to construct validity evidence, and they say that to state that a test has construct validity, two types of validity evidence must be accumulated. The first is convergent, and the second is discriminant. Convergent validity is obtained when a measure correlates well with other tests that are believed to measure the same construct. Okay, so the Beck Depression Inventory correlates highly with depression items on the depression scale of the MMPI. So that's convergent validity evidence for the Beck. So let's say we all design a new inventory of depression. So to accumulate convergent validity evidence, we would need to correlate our new instrument of depression with other already known, convergent or tests that have good construct validity, such as the Beck or the depression scale of the MMPI. Okay, discriminant validity evidence is obtained when a test does not correlate significantly with tests measuring different constructs. So, for example, evidence of discriminant validity occurs when an instrument is designed to measure, depression and is not significantly correlated with an instrument that measures trait anxiety. So we develop our test of depression and we don't want it to correlate with good test of anxiety or other constructs that are very different from depression. Then we would be accumulating discriminant validity evidence. So according to Campbell and Fisk, we need both convergent and discriminant validity evidence.